Welcome people made in the image of the living God. In this video I will discuss slavery in the Bible, and in doing so abandon a little bit the method of my previous videos. In this series of video I will define slavery, servanthood, and show that American slavery pre-1870s contrasts a lot compared to the approved slavery of the Bible. While assuming most viewers are familiar with the recent American slavery that was the core to the American Civil War. I would like to note that all people are created in the image of God and deserve the rights granted to them by God, whether they are born or not, whether they are black, white, Asian, Aborigine, Indian, Native American, and so on. The majority of people do not have the right to say one is not a person. Atheist, humanist, and evolutionary thought consistently denies this. I will show that God commanded Israel not to treat slaves harshly. I will show some people wanted to become slaves. I will show that Jesus Christ is represented as a servant and served as one. And finally, I will talk about children as slaves, mainly as a commentary on Numbers 31:15 through 18. Slavery defined. I'm going to quote an article I looked up. I'll have to get the reference for you later. Pardon me if I don't pronounce the Greek correctly. In the ancient world, service and slavery were closely related, so much so that one can scarcely distinguish the one from the other. The original words used for servants and service carry a variety of meanings, between which it is not always easy to determine what is meant. Arndt and Gingrich documented that the Greek word doulos meant slave, but that it was also used in a wider sense to denote any kind of dependence. In 2 Corinthians 4:5, the apostles are called the douloi, plural of doulos, of the Christians. Christ took on the form of a doulos. As stated in Philippians 2:7, Paul designated himself as doulos of Christ. In Romans 1:1, Philippians 1:1, Galatians 1:10, and numerous other passages, the term can describe a person who is obligated in some way, whether voluntary or involuntary, to another person. Due to this broad use, various translations have employed a wide range of words to render the meaning of doulos in English. Using Romans 1:1 as a case in point, the New King James Version has bondservant, the New Living Translation has slave, the King James Version and American Standard Version have servant, and the Darby Bible has bondman. The Hebrew word Ebed is similar to the Greek doulos in that it can be translated as slave or servant. In Exodus 4:10, Moses referred to himself as the servant, Ebed, of God. Abraham called himself the Ebed of the angels who came to visit him in Genesis 18:3. In Genesis 39:17 through 19, Potiphar's wife described Joseph as the Hebrew Ebed, and Genesis 24:2 talks about the eldest Ebed in Abraham's house, who ruled over all he had. The purpose of including this brief description of the two most common terms for a slave is to show that our modern use of the word slave generally evokes mental images of cruelty, injustice, and against a person's will. While such ideas could be included in the biblical usage, they do not necessarily fit every time the words are used. Instead, the picture that we often see when the biblical words for slave are employed is a mutually beneficial arrangement similar to an employer-employee relationship. To further illustrate the true nature of much of Old Testament slavery, Abraham's relationship with his slave Eliezer should be examined. In Genesis 15:2 through 3, Abraham lamented the fact that he was childless. In talking with God, he stated that the heir of his wealth was Eliezer of Damascus, his slave. In verse 3 of chapter 15, Abraham described Eliezer as one born in my house. Later in Genesis 24:2, Abraham's oldest servant, probably Eliezer, ruled over all that he had. And to this, the fact that Abraham armed 318 trained servants, in the Hebrew, Ebed, to bring back Lot after he had been captured, in Genesis 14 through 15. If the slave-owner relationship was anything less than mutually trusting, Abraham most likely would not have intentionally armed his slaves. Okay, now American slavery. Slavery as we know it in the United States history was very different than the slavery allowed by God. Slavery in the U.S. started with kidnapping, which God required the death penalty for. Therefore, anyone who took slaves from Africa or anywhere else, or bought them, should have received the death penalty. But without this penalty, there was no deterrent, and in law, the blacks were not even considered persons. These slaves also earned nothing in return. Again, I'll assume most viewers are familiar. To contrast with biblical slavery now. Slavery, for the most part, authorized by God, was of the bond servant or indentured servant type. That is, the servant sold himself into it because he owed money for one reason or the other, and then earned his freedom. Or the person was one who was taken as a war reparation for war crimes. Israel warred with wicked countries who did very vile deeds, such as sacrificing children to a false god called Molech. It would have been better to be a slave, being an evil person, than to die and go to hell. Leviticus 25:47 through 49 provides an example of slavery caused by debt. Now if a sojourner or a stranger close to you becomes rich, and one of your brethren who dwells by him becomes poor, and sells himself to the stranger, notice that, sells himself, or a sojourner close to you, or to a member of the stranger's family, after he is sold, he may be redeemed again. One of his brothers may redeem him, or his uncle's son may redeem him, or anyone who is near of kin to him in his family may redeem him, or if he is able, he may redeem himself. Even the law of the United States allows this. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution did not abolish slavery, but retained justifiable slavery, which is moral and avoids widespread bankruptcy and incarceration. Amendment 13, 1865, Section 1 reads, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the parties shall be duly convicted, shall exist within the United States." The only place I know this to be exercised is in the prisons, where they put the inmates to work. Prisons, by the way, are not biblical. Nowadays, when people owe money and cannot pay, they can file for bankruptcy, and the government basically just forgives what they owe. And this is wrong because it is stealing. As additional evidence along these lines, in Exodus 22:1-3, the Bible discusses a situation in which a man was caught in the act of thievery. The thief was instructed to restore what he stole, returning 4 sheep and 5 oxen for every one stolen. The text further states he should make full restitution. If he has nothing, then he shall be sold for his theft. Being sold into slavery was often a government-regulated punishment based on a criminal action. One can see, then, that it is morally permissible to revoke the freedoms of certain people or groups of people based on their inappropriate conduct. The criminal is enslaved until the debt is paid off.